So I'm going to talk about something a little different. Next slide, please. I'm going to be speaking not about my experience as a language ambassador directly, although that was my lived experience in analyzing the program. But I'm doing my doctorate at the University of Toronto in linguistic anthropology, linguistic and semiotic anthropology. Which overlaps with sociocultural anthropology. So on the screen now is a bit of a crash course in North American anthropology. We speak French at home with the kids. I speak English in my working life. But this was a real opportunity to get into a project that's actually building a data set and modeling language and applying some of the principles from linguistic anthropology. So let me explain a bit about what the perspective is. Next slide, please. So here we've got theoretical linguistics, which is sometimes associated with generative grammar, generative linguistics. And this is really concerned with language as a kind of abstract system of thought, right? Symbols encoding for, real word references, really concerned with semantics and semantic representation. Linguistic anthropology is more concerned with language as a social technology, right? What can we do with words? How do people switch in social contexts, the code of their speech? What kinds of stuff are not in computational linguistics corpora? So in this sense, linguistic anthropologists, often we could say sociolinguists, are interested in the pragmatics, the practical side. Okay, so next slide, please. Back one. There. Nope, back one, please. There we go. So, I mean, I'm exaggerating with language wars, but the idea here is that linguistics, capital L, deals with what we would call linguistic or language, capital L, language competence, right? The ability to speak and understand language. But anthropologists are interested in communicative competence, which is how do you know what kinds of language to use in what situations. And in small type there, I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can see some of the kinds of things that are usually not in computational linguistics data sets, but are nevertheless part of how we use language in a social situation. Okay, now next slide. The next slide here is just an example of what a conversation analysis is, kind of a subfield in linguistic anthropology. And you can see there's annotations all over the place for non-linguistic signs, right? Things like changing in prosody, body language, eye contact, when people overlap in speech. Those are all social cues, and they all have their kind of social and cultural norms. Okay, next slide, please. So for my doctorate at U of T, I'm taking some of this perspective on how language is used as a social system, and I'm looking at the field of AI. And I'm looking at how scientists are communicating, how we all communicated for the Aya project. And this really drives to the heart of the kind of the madness of 2023 when with ChatGPT and LLMs kind of hitting mainstream, this kind of tension between what it means to be human, what it means to be a machine in this kind of post-AI world we're living in. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to is that there already is a lot of work being done in the social sciences around AI, and specifically a kind of subfield called critical data studies. So you might recognize some of the titles here, but there is a real attention being paid to data as a kind of a social technology, a social object. Data as something that travels and has its own kind of social life. Next slide, please. Critical data studies, sometimes you hear people talk about critical algorithm studies, right? Looking at the specific harms and biases and social inequities that come from data sets that are presumed to be bias-free and kind of value neutral, but in fact really encode a lot of the social norms that we live in our lives. Next slide, please. So one of the things we look at in data studies is the metaphors that are often used. And this is a big part of my work, is looking at metaphor and analogy in communicating science. So, I mean, the kind of dominant metaphor is treating data as like this non-renewable resource that's found in the ground, right? Data is the new oil, the gold rush for data, even data is the new cotton, right? Adding kind of a layer of racial inequity on top of this. But the point is that like data is often seen as just this thing that's lying around, a natural resource, just waiting for us to scoop it up, extract it, and create value from it. But it's a lot more complicated than that, right? It's data is created, data is made. Um, and Nick Seaver and some others have done some great work around different ideas and metaphors we can use to describe data and the data process. Data gardening, right? He worked with a team who were tagging data for a music recommendation system. And they spoke of their work as caregivers, almost as gardeners. They were tending the data, pruning it, working with it day to day, right? Taking pride in the quality of that data, because as we know and is becoming clear, the data is the thing, right? That the quality of the data really, really has an outsized impact on what kind of outputs you get. Next slide, please. So these kind of cultural norms apply to the process of science itself as well. You know, science as often proceeding in a kind of closed gatekeeper system. You know, we are usually working at universities or other academic settings that are not open to everybody. You know, we usually have credentials. Our work is judged by publishing in, you know, a relatively, you know, narrow selection of journals. Um, and we open that process up with Aya, right? And so there are new cultural norms and cultural um, uh, um, situations that we find ourselves in when we open things up. Because the expertise in language is not the same as the expertise in machine learning. So we really wanted to open it up to people who are experts in their spoken language, which is people themselves. You don't need a degree for that. Next slide, please. So the idea is that language, from an anthropological perspective, creates social connections, right? Language is the glue that holds society together. Um, and this is something we found during our work together, right? The language was a gateway into all the social minutiae that people use to make sense of their lives. Next slide, please. So if language creates social networks and social cohesion, it's fair to say that Aya creates social cohesion through language. One of the things we did to get to know each other and to just kind of share, you know, the connections between our languages and our cultures was this YouTube playlist, right, of music. And there's currently 37 songs on this list in 24 different languages. And this is, I mean, this is it. This is data, right? This isn't kind of peripheral to the words that go in the box and the words that go in the model, but this kind of provenance, the connections that are made between the language and social life, that is key to understanding the fullness of what language does for culture. Next slide, please. And you're going to have to just keep clicking, right? To see all those, to all these images come up. Can you click through those? Yeah, keep going until that slide is full. So people shared images of where they were, right? Santiago, Chile, Italy. We've got many different countries in Africa. So this gave us a sense of place. And we also had a recipe exchange. I think that's the last one there. We also had a recipe exchange where we shared some recipes that really only make sense in your mother tongue, right? We had at least one person say when they see a language model, the first thing they do is test it to see if it can describe recipes using the language, using the ingredients that I would use with my mother, right? Um, and this is my dreams to make a recipe book out of all this and circulate it, see what we get. But it's been an incredible experience being part of this group and seeing kind of the social life of language, the social life of data. And I just want to thank Sarah and Madeline in particular for allowing me to hang out. I think at the beginning they were like, "What's this guy doing here? Like, what does he want to do?" But I had a great fun working with the French language and with the communities that supported that data collection.